Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM, your local community radio station. My name is Andy, and we are broadcasting on Yagra and Turrbal Country. And today on the show, we are going to be talking about Pine Gap. It is the secretive US military spy base in the middle of Australia. We forget it's there a lot of the time, but the US does not, because it is vital to their military capabilities. And unfortunately, in recent years, it's also been vital to Israel's military capabilities in their decimation of Gaza and their attacks against surrounding Middle Eastern nations, Yemen, Lebanon, and Iran. And so, whatever our Australian government says and does about these things, Australia is always contributing with this base in the middle of Australia, using Australian facilities, and with a number of Australian government employees working there, although they don't get the full security clearance for all the US data, but they are there contributing to these overseas wars. And so it's good to check in about Pine Gap every now and then. It's good for people to raise awareness about it and voice their disapproval. And that is what people are doing this weekend. There is a big convergence happening at Pine Gap, which is not just about a protest, as we will hear, against the base, although there will be that, but it's also trying to bring together people from across the country who are working for peace and particularly for justice for Palestine, and bring them together and talk about where next for that movement. So we'll hear from Natalie Farah shortly about that. Then we'll also hear from Richard Tanter, who has dedicated much of his life to studying Pine Gap and what happens there. So I chatted to him about that topic. And then finally, we will hear from Gil Scrine, who is a local filmmaker who back in 1982 released a film called Home on the Range about Pine Gap. It was quite a significant film at the time, and it's actually going to be screened in Brisbane as our own local Brisbane contribution to a weekend of action against Pine Gap. And then afterwards there will be a few different activists who have resisted Pine Gap over the years, just having a chat about what that looked like from the women's peace camp outside Pine Gap in 1983 to convergences in 1987 and 2002, and then a couple of walk-ons at Pine Gap, which, full disclosure, I did walk onto Pine Gap myself in 2016 as part of one of these protest actions and to try to bring awareness to it, and ended up in the Supreme Court of Northern Territory, which is an interesting experience. But I do think it's important to bring awareness about this base and its constant role in US warfare, disastrous and often illegal wars overseas. So that's what's coming up on the show. Let's start off by hearing from Nat Farah.
My name is Natalie Farah, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Convergence organisers today.
And Nat, we are speaking to you from Mbantua in Aranda Country, also known as Alice Springs. Are you there as part of this closed Pine Gap convergence? Can you start off by telling us about what's the idea behind the convergence?
Yes, it's a very beautiful morning. I'm on the dry riverbed in the middle of the town in Mbantua, and I suppose the idea came about around 6 months ago when we were having a bit of a strategic pause to think about where to go from here. The last few years we've seen some incredible mass mobilizing around the genocide in Palestine, and slowly that focus has shifted towards Australia's role, this continent's role in that genocide and in other genocides around the world, and basically what it comes to, the crux of Australia's complicity is in three parts. And the first part is in weapons supply chain. So that's, over 85 Australian companies that continuously provide parts to weapons to the US and Israeli military. And we've seen a lot of pickets and protests and direct action at these weapon factories all around the continent. The second, way that Australia is complicit is through the AUKUS agreement, which basically places Australia as a very strong ally of the US, and it is also disadvantageous to Australia, in terms of like defence. And so that's a really interesting thing to be looking at. This third, very important sort of manifestation of the Australia-US alliance is this facility called Pine Gap here in Mbantua. Basically, it is a US spy base that's in the middle of the desert. And it's been here since the 60s, and in a very simplified version of what it is that it provides intelligence information to the US Army and allies. So practically every US war since the 60s has been supplied information from Australia. And so this not only makes us complicit in every US war, but it also makes Australia actually a target. And with the US in its current chaos and under the Trump administration, this is becoming more and more important. So we thought it's time that we put attention on this facility. When we first came up with the idea in Naarm, the first thing that we did was we contacted our comrades here in Mbantua, so Mbantua Palestine, a great group of grassroots activists, and they have been building relationships with Aranda people for quite a long time, and Aranda people have been wanting for this to happen for a long time. I mean, this is also not the first convergence. There's been many protests across the years. The last one was in 2016, but this will definitely be the biggest one since 1987.
So, as I understand it, there's a convergence part that's really about getting people together and talking to each other, but then also, of course, being in the proximity, there is plans for protests at Pine Gap. Is that right?
Yeah, so the first 2 days, which is tomorrow and the day after, on the Saturday and Sunday, it will be, we don't really want to call it a conference because, it's going to have lots of different ways of relating. It's not just panel discussions and lectures and things like that. There'll be lots of different spaces for people to gather, conversations ranging from, decolonizing, hearing from mob here, hearing from First Nations people about what campaigns they have and what work they are doing, and how we can support their work, all the way to, we've got some Jewish people who are from the Jewish Council of Australia, as well as Palestinians from Meganjan. So there's Rima Naji that's coming to talk about the anti-Semitism Royal Commission and all of that kind of stuff. And then at the end we will have a big sort of all-in discussion about where to next, practically looking at what are the steps that we need to create the structures and to create the sustainability across the continent, because this has to be a continent-wide effort to campaign for Australia to cut ties with the US. And then on Monday we have a day of action, and at this stage we're not communicating exactly what that's going to look like, but it will certainly be outside of the Pine Gaps facility.
If people are unable to make it, and that's probably most people hearing this now because it's a long way to travel, how can people stay connected?
There's going to be a broadcast link that's shared around on social media, so Instagram and Facebook, and then you can watch the plenaries and some of the workshops online. And then afterwards, we're really hoping to create some sort of a resource. Maybe it's a zine, maybe we'll put things on the website. We're going to be writing down a lot of the really important information and knowledge and wisdom that's shared, and sharing it across the movement. And so just stay in touch and keep an eye on our socials. So we're Amman on socials as well as Mbandwa Palestine. And the website is closepinegap.org.au. And if anyone listening would like to be involved in the conversations about how do we move forward and what kind of structures and strategy, would be really, really keen to hear from you. And I keep going back to structure because we really need to collaborate at this time. And this is the crux of so many struggles across the continent. And yeah, really keen to be connecting with folks and see where we go from here.
Okay, thanks heaps, Nat.
Thank you so much.
You are listening to The Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ, and we have just been speaking with Nat Farah about the convergence happening this weekend at Pine Gap, and we are going to now hear from Richard Tanter, who is a researcher who has dedicated a lot of time to revealing what the Australian government has consistently put zero effort into revealing to the Australian public, which is what actually happens at Pine Gap. So let's have a listen to Richard.
Hello, I'm Richard Tanter from Melbourne, from Naarm land, and I work now as an independent researcher on intelligence and defence issues in Australia. I'm an honorary professorial fellow at the University of Melbourne, and I'm a senior research associate with the Nautilus Institute.
And much of your research has been dedicated to Pine Gap, the American spy base in the middle of Australia. So to start off with the question to which you have dedicated much of your career, what does Pine Gap do?
Pine Gap is a very old facility, going back to being established in the 1960s. The original purpose of it, and still very important, is what is technically called space-based signals intelligence interception and collection, to provide strategic intelligence picked up and then processed from those satellites. The second purpose of Pine Gap developed about 25 years ago, and that's effectively the reverse of that first version, which is big antennas on the ground at Pine Gap pointed up at other countries' communication satellites. Basically, Pine Gap has two sets of large ears, one in space, picking up emissions from the surface of the Earth, and the other on the ground, picking up emissions from other people's communication satellites. The third version is effectively providing the Americans with early warning of ballistic missile launches. These satellites telescopes that operate in the infrared rather than the visible dimension, and they can pick up the thermal signal, the heat signal of the launch of rockets and missiles and some kinds of aircraft under certain circumstances. And that's effectively the core of the early warning capacity missile attack for the United States. So Pine Gap has three separate, pretty distinct functions.
Now, the signals intelligence at one point would have been about surveilling people's actions, but as I understand it, as war has become more high-tech, that information has become more vital to US warfighting overseas.
Immensely so, and in particular with the beginning of the so-called War on Terror. Pine Gap's principal role by the end of the Cold War, in terms of the volume of signals intelligence activity conducted there, was particularly aimed at communications, in particular military and political communications interception. And that became more and more important, particularly with the War on Terror, as the US military said, We need intelligence on what Saddam Hussein's tank formations are doing. We need intelligence, communications intelligence, directly related to the combat situation on the ground, and we need it quite quickly. So that's quite a different way of thinking from, if you like, the slow strategic intelligence function of working out what Soviet missile capacities were in the 1970s and 1980s. And of course, that still happens as well.
And in recent years, as war has got more high-tech with drone warfare and these days the use of artificial intelligence weapons, things like that, has Pine Gap become more crucial to US military endeavours?
Absolutely. To take the first example of drone activities, drones, formerly, according to the Americans, uncrewed aerial vehicles, whether they're armed or whether they are simply for surveillance, these are incredibly important innovation for the Americans, and we've seen obviously in the wars in Ukraine and Iran how important they are for offensive operations. To be used effectively, they require a great deal of intelligence. You don't just send out a drone and say, go and find me a target. It doesn't work that way. And so you have this intersection of different sources and forms of intelligence, particularly Pine Gap signals intelligence, but also we know, of course, there are satellites in different orbits just carrying visual telescopes, cameras, basically, overhead imagery, and then they also have human intelligence. All these things are mashed together, as the jargon says. And so the key issue is, how do you get them to what the Americans charmingly call the warfighter in a reasonable amount of time. For Pine Gap, intelligence contribution to US drone operations began to be really important during the so-called War on Terror in the early 2000s and the 2010s. And Pine Gap was extremely important in providing intelligence in offensive drone operations, not only in countries with which the United States was at war, in a quasi-legal sense, but also in countries with which neither the United States nor Australia were in any kind of declared or legalised war relationship, such as Pakistan, or now Somalia, or now Yemen. And so Pine Gap became incredibly important because of that. But equally, we know now from the development of the war in Gaza, in particular, the Israeli invasion of Gaza, supported by the United States, effectively supported by Australia as well, we know that there is an extraordinary amount of intelligence which is available from facilities like Pine Gap in Australia and its companion facility in Britain called Menwith Hill, which is militarily salient to Israeli operations. It's very useful to them. And B, we know, because of what Edward Snowden told us about in the documents that he released in about 2013, that there have been a whole series of legal agreements between the National Security Agency, which is the principal American presence at Pine Gap, and the Israeli equivalent in the Israeli Defence Force. And so we now know that there's a flow of intelligence from Pine Gap passed on automatically to National Security Agency headquarters in Maryland in the United States, and then, according to these agreements, made available to the Israelis whenever they ask. So that gives us, that's a second technological development, if you like. And the third, in particular, you mentioned, is really, really important, which is the development of cyber operations, particularly offensive cyber operations, combined in particular with very advanced forms of artificial intelligence. If you use the model very simply of artificial intelligence as an elaborated and highly sophisticated form of machine learning, then you can think both about signals intelligence, this massive signal is being collected, decrypted, analysed to try and make sense of it, and then you've got to work out what you're going to do with it, or the imagery, the infrared imagery intelligence of a battlefield from the launch of ballistic missiles on a battlefield. That's pretty much two perfect sets of, if you like, arenas to use the combination of artificial intelligence and cyber applications. And indeed, Pine Gap is now a major centre of cyber offensive operations.
You've touched on it just then, but a big part of this convergence happening this weekend at Pine Gap is about the role of that facility in Israel's destruction of Gaza. How much of a role has Pine Gap played in that?
I think Pine Gap has been extremely important for support for Israel Defence Force activities, firstly in Gaza itself, but secondly, of course, in relation to its operations to neighbouring countries such as Lebanon and Yemen. So there are kind of three areas of application there. We do not have direct information, direct source, which says on day X, satellite Y downlinked through Pine Gap and sent information to Israel. What we have are three things. Firstly, the signals intelligence satellites controlled through Pine Gap, in particular 4 of them called Advanced Orion satellites, 4 of them positioned over from the Pacific through to the Indian Ocean. The westernmost 3 of those satellites have a coverage which covers all of the Arabian Peninsula through to the Mediterranean. So that's an extraordinary technical capacity to intercept a vast range of communications of potential salience and relevance to the war conducted by Israel in Gaza. Secondly, we have the historical record. We know back in 1973, at the time of the what was then called the Fourth Arab-Israeli War, that the United States, without informing Australia, took data derived, downlinked, processed at Pine Gap and passed it directly to the Israelis to their very considerable strategic advantage in their conflict, in particular with Egypt. The other historical information we have comes from the former National Security Agency contractor, David Rosenberg, who was at Pine Gap for about 18 years until the early 2000s. And he has written both in his memoir, which was cleared by the National Security Agency for publication, and in interviews, for example, with Peter Cronauer from Declassified Australia. He is very clear that in his time at Pine Gap was actively assisting Israel in these matters, and he has no doubt that continued after he left. The last reason why we are so sure about Pine Gap's involvement with Gaza is the Snowden documents, which give a history of a 20-year history in his time up to 2013 of a very large number of complicated and dense legal agreements which essentially give the Israelis pretty much clear access to anything that was collected that they think may be relevant to them.
So, this weekend there will be activists from around the country converging in Alice Springs at Pine Gap. And you are a researcher, and I suppose have tried to keep your research somewhat impartial, but you're certainly critical of Pine Gap. And so, in your view, what are the reasons why Australians should be concerned about Pine Gap?
I think the first issue is simply secrecy. Our Australian government has been economical with the truth is far too polite a way to put it. And that's the first thing, not telling Australians exactly what Pine Gap does. The second thing is that Pine Gap is a risk factor for Australia. We know that throughout the Cold War, Australian intelligence agencies informed, and certainly they were correct about this, informed Australian governments that in the event of a global war involving the United States and the Soviet Union, Pine Gap, as a critically important node in American nuclear command and control and communications, would be attacked as a matter of high priority by the Soviet Union. That still applies today for China and the Russian Federation under certain circumstances. And the Australian government has never been open about this matter with Australians. The third is the question whether, on balance, and these things are always a matter of looking at positives and negatives, if you like, even about the darkest things like nuclear warfare. It's very hard to think about the positives, but in terms of people who claim that Pine Gap contributes to a deterrence function, I think it's very clear that the balance about Pine Gap is towards support for our contribution, without discussion with the Australian people, to American nuclear war fighting capabilities, to distinguish it from so-called nuclear deterrence. And that's before we start talking about extra-legal assassinations in the form of drone warfare. And the very last for the moment is what we know from our understanding of the extraordinary violence of the war in Gaza, and now the attacks by the United States on Iran. The Iranians are hardly blameless in a general sense, but this is a level of outright criminality by the Israeli government and by the United States government. And for Australia, actually, I also say this was something I talked about with Malcolm Fraser until his death, when we worked closely together on the book that became his book, Dangerous Allies. And we were both aware, thinking initially about drone warfare, but now the same applies to the wars in Gaza and with Iran, that at some stage there will be evidence coming into the public domain which makes clear that Australian government personnel at Pine Gap knew of operations conducted on the basis of intelligence from Pine Gap which are simply illegal, either in terms of gross violations of the laws of war or bordering on something much worse than that. In the case of Israel and the war in Gaza, matters of genocide.
Now, just finally, Richard, this week we are screening Gil Scrine's 1982 film Home on the Range, which is about Pine Gap. Could you share with us, I guess, what was the importance of this film when it came out?
Gil Scrine's film Home on the Range, in which he collaborated with Desmond Ball, with whom I worked for many years, but Ball at that stage in 1980 had just published a book called A Suitable Piece of Real Estate, American Installations in Australia. And in that book, and then in Gil Scrine's film, unpacking parts of that story, Scrine and Ball documented for the first time the importance or the fact of these largely either secret facilities or facilities which were known, but about which the Australian public had either been told, given misleading accounts, or in the case of Pine Gap, simply a formal cover story intended overtly to mislead the public. Scrine's film, using extraordinary footage from Pine Gap, actually at that time he was able to get much closer to the facility itself than is possible today, but he did extraordinary work to make clear what was happening at Pine Gap. He gave a voice to Desmond Ball, who was even by that stage a world-renowned intelligence expert, certainly with a more detailed knowledge of what happened at Pine Gap, much more than most politicians knew, and able to give a very clear explanation, A, of the dangers, and B, of the problem caused, frankly, in what we'll just call Australian democracy, by outright lying, by deception, and by a form of collaboration with the United States which sought to make sure that Australian people did not have a voice in their future about Pine Gap.
Okay, thanks very much, Richard, for chatting with us today.
Happy to be with you. I wish I could be at the convergence, and best wishes to everyone for that.
Richard Tanter, long-term expert on Pine Gap, and I asked him about that film. Gil Scrine's Home on the Range would help to show the public a bit about what the US presence in Australia really meant, both for Australian people and Australian democracy, and also for our role in international affairs and wars overseas. Let's hear from Gil Scrine about Home on the Range.
My name's Gil Scrine. I'm a filmmaker, a film distributor, a writer, a painter, a father, a grandfather. Yeah, that's me.
And today we are going to be talking about your work as a filmmaker, and particularly the film you made in 1982 called Home on the Range, about Pine Gap. Can you tell us a bit about what inspired the film back then?
Well, it started really with a filmmaker called Peter Watkins, an English filmmaker whose seminal film called The War Game was banned by the BBC in the mid-60s. Peter came to Sydney and showed a film of his at the Sydney Film Festival in the mid-70s and suggested that a group of us get together to explore the different issues in Australian life. It was called the People's Commission. We took various subjects, the plight of Aboriginal people, the way television news is changing, and the other one was the American bases in Australia, which is the topic that I chose to explore with a group of people. I had been talking to a guy called Des Ball at ANU, who was the expert in Australia on Pine Gap, and I had begun to understand just how sinister this place is. I then began to make the film. So around about 1976, I started to try and raise money. The Committee for Disarmament ended up being a sponsor, and they found, I don't know how much money, but enough money to go and shoot the thing. We finally got some money from the Australian Film Commission and put the film out there. It won Best Film at Sydney Film Festival in 1982, which sort of surprised me. And, you know, what that film talked about was not only Pine Gap, but Northwest Cape, a place called Naranga in South Australia, and various other bases which no longer exist in Australia now. But Pine Gap was the one that took my interest mostly, and the second part of the film deals with the fall of the Whitlam government and how Pine Gap played a part in that.
At the time, was there much other media exploring Pine Gap and its implications for Australia?
No. I mean, in Alice Springs itself, Pine Gap was known as a space base, exploring space, looking for little green men. It was so stupid and innocent and kind of gormless, you know. The attitude in Alice Springs was one of complete self-interest. There were, even at that time, I don't know, 400 or 500 American families living in the town, bringing to the economy hundreds of thousands of dollars. There was a baseball club, American cars driving everywhere around the place, left-hand drive. And, you know, it was one of those weird situations where locals seemed to turn a blind eye. And yet what was really going on at this base was something quite, you know, sinister and has become even more sinister since the assault by Israel on Gaza, for example, not to mention Iran now. Pine Gap is essential to targeting these drones and these missile attacks. So Australia is completely complicit in these wars. We don't kick up any kind of fuss. You never hear Albanese or Wong talk about it. And, you know, there's a good reason for that. And I think that's because Whitlam was dismissed and in a CIA conspiracy, which you have to look at my film to see.
Now, Pine Gap is not a particularly easy place to get to, and it's quite secretive and has a lot of kind of security and legal things set up around it. Were there challenges on making a film on this subject?
Yes, it was. and I was determined to get pictures of the base. I rented a light plane and a pilot, and we flew up around the place and took pictures from half a mile in the air, which a lot of aircraft were able to see it as they flew into Alice Springs. That was no secret, but it was just a little tiny place in this sheltered valley, white domes, it looked a bit like airport radar domes. So I got in touch with a local ranger, park ranger in Alice Springs by the name of Philip Nitschke. Now, Philip later on became quite famous as so-called Dr. Death. He promoted euthanasia in Australia and had a website and so on and spoke widely. But at that time, Phil was a park ranger and he knew the ridges around the base. So he led us up this particular ridge where he knew we could set up a tripod and take a roll of film, zooming in and out and coming up close and sort of panning and so on. Well, we did this, and after about 10 minutes, we spotted a Land Rover on an opposite ridge and a guy in shorts, typical Northern Territory police uniform, with binoculars looking at us. And Phil said, "Right, boys, time to go." So our plan was to switch magazines in the camera because we were shooting on film. So we took the film out of the camera and put a dummy roll in the camera in case we were stopped on the way back to town, which we weren't. But on the way, Phil jumped out of the car and ran and hid the canister with the film in a rabbit hole. Then it gets dark. We're in town. A group of Aboriginal mob that we'd interviewed earlier in the day fronted up with a case of beer, and we began to sort of drink with them. And at one point, Phil said, "I've got to go." And he went off in the dark, found this rabbit hole, found the film, and got it back to us. And, we flew back to Sydney clutching this roll of film. And that was the first 16mm film taken ever of the base.
Now, in the years since you've made the film, the role of Pine Gap has expanded as warfare has become more digitised, and also we've seen a number of wars that use it, from the War on Terror and most recently Israel's assault on Gaza. I guess when you look back at the film, do you feel like it's still relevant for today?
I think it's really relevant insofar as the story of how Whitlam was deposed is, for anyone in power in Australia, that this is not a subject for discussion. And if you go against the American intelligence agencies, you are likely to be hounded out of office one way or the other. So I don't think it's a healthy thing for Australian politicians to speak out about it. Some do when they're in opposition, but once they get into power, it's a completely different story. I think it reflects the deepening ties between Australia and the US, which is, one of the greatest preoccupations of my career, is to understand how Australia is being manipulated into becoming the sort of spear carrier of the US. We're giving up territory, we're giving up our military capacity, and we're, completely joined at the hip now with the US. The number of troops now in the Northern Territory, the number of aircraft coming and going, the ability for the US to house their submarines in Western Australia, not to mention the hideous AUKUS agreement that we're indulging in. These are all symptoms of an Australia that is deeply anxious about who we are. And we do not understand this, and we need to, and until we do, these things will keep happening and frankly get worse.
Now, if anybody is listening to this and can make it to the Queensland College of Arts on Saturday, they can watch the film. But what about if they're not able to do that? Is there any way they can find out more or possibly watch the film?
Well, I'm in the business of distributing films as well. Have been for 30 years. Antidote Films is my company, and we are currently in the business of launching a streaming site. It'll be a boutique sort of streamer. There'll be about 20 films to start with, but there'll be a curated collection, Home on the Range being one of them. Several others of my films and my friends' films will be there, and they won't be always the latest thing. Some of the films will be from the 80s, 90s and noughties, but they'll be important films, and we're trying to get rights and resurrect them. The streaming site will be called WAF, W-A-F, which stands for Watch Antidote Films. We couldn't think of a more suitable name because WAF seems silly enough, but that's where you'll find it.
Okay, thanks very much, Gil. You are listening to 4ZZZ. You were just hearing from Gil Scrine, filmmaker who, amongst other films, made Home on the Range, which is about Pine Gap and which will be being screened at Queensland College of Arts. Come along to that if you want to be inspired and be part of a discussion about what it means to assert Australian sovereignty in some way and, you know, kind of publicly challenge Australia's just a blind submission to US military policy, which, you know, in a long time there haven't been attacks on Australia that the US has needed to defend this place from, but instead it has led Australia into disastrous wars which have caused loss of a lot of lives and a lot of well-being and ultimately not produced happy democratic regimes in the places where the US has gone to war. And so it really is a time to question whether Australia should be involved in this. Of course, the current nut job in the US White House, it means it's even more of a time to question it. But it always is, about what kind of place do we want Australia to be? How do we want to contribute to the world? And do we get a say over that? And of course, the interesting question about Pine Gap, as Gil Scrine brought up, and US military policy in general, is a question of whether Australian politicians have the ability to say no to the US. And if not, is that something that we need to do something about? Is that a reason to challenge that alliance and the giving over of Australian territory to the US? And of course, it's only gotten more so since that film was made, and the US now has so many access to so many Australian bases, and of course, there's things like US aircraft bases at Tyndall and Pine Gap being used for US overseas wars. And of course, the big build-up is whether this is going to be involved in a battle for global superpower status between two countries, neither of which is Australia, and whether it'll come to some kind of world war conflict that Australia will be dragged into, even though a war doesn't do anybody any good, and it's certainly not in Australia's interest to have a war between the US and China, who is a regional power and Australia's biggest trading partner, etc. So anyway, there's lots of reasons why Australia might want to question where these US bases are leading us. And so come along, if you can't, keep tuning into the Paradigm Shift and other independent media like it, where we can ask some of these big questions. And as Nat Farah said, it's about building a movement, about getting people together, figuring out how we can assert some kind of power against this massive global empire. And I'll see you next week.